Perfect, thank you. Good evening, everybody, or probably I should also say good morning to our colleagues who are I've seen a few people joining from South Australia and the Philippines, so it's a real pleasure to be here, to have been invited to speak to you today. I'm going to talk to you about the National Child Mortality Database report into the deaths of children and young people due to traumatic incidents. So first of all, you might be wondering, what's the National Child Mortality Database? So we're a programme of work that collects and analyses data from our statutory child death review process. So that's a process in England that reviews the deaths of all live-born children who die of any cause before their 18th birthday. As you can see on the screen there, I've just put some details about how we're commissioned. So that's through the Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership on behalf of NHS England. And I'm employed by the University of Bristol, and we lead this collaboration that runs this programme of work. But really importantly, we also have charity input into our programme of work. And our partner charities there are the Lullaby Trust, SANS, and Child Bereavement UK. What's the purpose of us as a programme of work is then to understand how and why children die, to identify learning that might inform policy and practice, and that can be at local, regional or national level, and then ultimately to reduce the number of children who die. I'm going to talk very briefly about the child death review process now. So some of you will be aware of this diagram and aware of the process here in England if you've contributed to it. But I think it's important that people understand sort of where our data comes from. And this gives you an idea of the sort of richness of it. So in England, child death overview panels, which we call CDOPs, are multi-agency panels who are tasked with reviewing deaths of children that are normally resident in their area. As I said, that's a legal duty, and they are obliged to notify us legally within 48 hours of any death occurring. Once they've made that notification into us, they then go through a really comprehensive multi-agency information gathering process. And that involves collecting information from anyone or any agency who had contact with the child during their life or was involved in the investigation of that child's death after they died. So that might include police, social care, healthcare, ambulance service, paramedics, Coast Guard, if they were involved, if it was a drowning event, education, any agency at all who's been involved. There's a set of statutory forms that the information is collected on, and there is an opportunity for the families themselves to contribute into the review process. So they're given the opportunity to give their views and ask any questions and give any comments that they have that relate to their child's death. They also collect up the final post-mortem report and the results of any other investigations. So that might include the coroner's inquest, any other child safeguarding practice review meetings or panels, or any other parallel processes. And then there's a two-stage review process. So there's a local review, and then it's followed by a CDOP review. Then that whole comprehensive data set is sent through to us in NCMD for us to analyse. So towards the end of 2020, we picked up through this process of gathering the 48-hour information, 48-hour notification information, we picked up that there was an increasing risk of death by trauma. So for 2020 to 21 and 2021 to 22 in comparison to the previous year of 1920. So the definition of trauma for us in NCMD includes deaths due to drowning, road traffic collisions, death due to violence and maltreatment, and deaths due to unintentional injuries. So falls, choking, accidental suffocation, those kind of things. At the same time as we picked up that signal in the data, we also started to receive a number of alerts from child death overview panels, and they felt they were seeing more trauma deaths overall, but particularly more drownings in their regions than they'd seen before. So we made a decision to do further, deeper analysis, and we produced this thematic report on trauma deaths. Just a little bit of additional context then before I get into the report itself. Our data release for 2022 showed that 63% of deaths due to trauma, deliberately inflicted injury, or suicide were found to have modifiable factors. So modifiable factors, for people who don't know, is a sort of standard term that we use in child death review in England. And it means that you've identified something which, by means of a locally or nationally achievable intervention, might be modified to reduce the risk of children dying in the future. And so that group, deliberately inflicted injury, suicide, and trauma, represents the second highest proportion of modifiable factors across all child deaths. Now, we know that the contributory factors, and therefore the corresponding opportunities for learning and prevention, are quite different, obviously, across that group. So this report that I'm going to talk to you about now identifies both the characteristics of children and young people who die in those ways, and then looks at the contributory factors and learning that were identified by those child death overview panel reviews that I mentioned, with obviously the aim of making recommendations to reduce the number of children who die. I just want to quickly show you this list of acknowledgements. So although we're commissioned to produce these reports, we don't do it in isolation. And there was a long list of people who were involved in helping us with this report. And you can see there the range of people involved. So we've got pediatrics, emergency medicine consultants, ambulance service, police, safeguarding expertise, and violence reduction partnerships, public health, across the board. So we had a lot of expertise in terms of helping us to analyse and interpret the information that we had. I also want to make a quick reference to our charities that we worked in partnership with on this report. So the Royal Life Saving Society UK, ROSPA, and the Child Accident Prevention Trust, who were also essential in helping us pull this report together. So what does this report look at then? So we looked at all children who died due to physical trauma between the 1st of April 2019 and the 31st of March 2022. So it includes that long list of causes that you can see there on the screen. What it doesn't include are deaths due to suicide or deliberate self-inflicted harm, or deaths due to anaphylaxis. And that's because we'd previously published a report on suicide specifically, a similar thematic report, and we're actually working on one that deals with anaphylaxis now. So it's those categories that you can see on the screen there that we look at. So this first slide then shows all the deaths that are due to trauma as a proportion of the total deaths that we've experienced in the period in England. So the green area on the left-hand side of the screen represents the 9,983 child deaths that were recorded in England in that 3-year period. The smaller orange box at the top shows that of that 9,983, 644 of those deaths were due to trauma. So that's about 6% of the total deaths that we had recorded in England. And then the little boxes at the bottom just show you the breakdown by their specific cause. So you can see the most common types of trauma there, which won't be a surprise to anyone. We had 211 that died in a vehicle collision, 160 that died of violence and maltreatment, and 84 that died of drowning. And then the other ones, as you can see, are much smaller numbers, although I've got a slide or two about those as we go on. So what were the characteristics then of children who died by trauma? So we saw that the death rate was higher in two age groups, the under fives and then the 15 to 17 year age group. And I'll come on to talk about the different causes of that in a minute. The rate of death was higher for males than females. Again, probably nothing too shocking for people there. The overall risk of death due to trauma was different by the ethnicity of the child, the level of deprivation in the area where they lived, and the season of the year, interestingly. But whether they lived in an urban or rural environment, we looked at that, and that didn't appear to affect the risk. So that was all of the analysis that we did on the sort of total number of deaths by trauma. But then we separated it out into the various sections because that made it a little bit easier in terms of interpretation. So I'm going to talk you through the overall information we've got on children and young people with a disability, a learning disability, or a neurodevelopmental condition. And then we'll come on to the specific stages of the report. So we looked at this group we wanted to be able to say something about this group as an individual sort of section in the report. And we noted that developmental conditions or disabilities were recorded as a contributory factor in 13% of all of the completed reviews where the child had died to trauma and died due to trauma, and that's across the whole age group. So that includes learning disability, neurodevelopmental condition, motor impairment, sensory impairment, and other conditions, sort of speech and language difficulties, those kind of things. So we then looked at the 5 to 17-year-old age group within that cohort of young people with a disability, and we reported that 8% had a learning disability recorded by the CDOP as a factor that might have contributed to their vulnerability, ill health, or death. And 11% had a neurodevelopmental condition recorded that might have contributed to vulnerability. And that included things like autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And those figures are higher than the population of those of children and young people in England with those respective conditions. So we weren't able to do a sort of deep dive that looked at that in any more detail. But in fact, another thematic report that we're working on at the moment is looking at all children who've died with a learning disability or autism. So we can go into that in a bit more detail and see what we can learn. So I'm going to talk now then about deaths due to vehicle collisions. So in this group, collisions includes cars, bicycles, scooters, motorbikes, mopeds. So all of the things that you might imagine it to include, quad bikes, but it also includes deaths as a result of collisions involving boats, trains, and aircraft. Those are obviously quite a lot rarer than collisions involving motor vehicles. But there were 211 in that group in the period. And although there was sort of a little bit of an increase, so from 61 in the first year to 78 in the last year, there wasn't strong statistical evidence of any change in the number of deaths from vehicle collisions across the 3 years. The 15 to 17-year-old age group had the highest death rate from vehicle collisions. Again, I'm sure that's not a surprise to people. That was kind of what we expected to see before we did the analysis. We saw twice as many boys as girls. We saw that the death rate for children that lived in the most deprived neighbourhoods was twice that for those that lived in the least deprived neighbourhoods in terms of vehicle collisions. But there was no evidence in this group that there was any difference by ethnicity, region, or urban or rural breakdown. So what was the learning then from child deaths due to vehicle collisions? So the contributory factors that were identified in these deaths were speeding or risk-taking behaviour. So that is both sometimes by the child when they're a driver of the vehicle, or if they'd, for example, got into a vehicle with somebody else who they knew to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Consumption of drugs and alcohol itself was reported as a contributory factor. So again, that included instances where the child that died had consumed drugs or alcohol, and then in other instances where whoever was driving the vehicle had consumed drugs or alcohol. Non-use of appropriate safety equipment, or sometimes sort of incorrect use of safety equipment, so seat belts in the main, and then complex home circumstances came up quite frequently. So that includes things like abuse, neglect, domestic abuse in the home, and sort of, challenging family backgrounds. The learning then from CDOPs included ensuring that road planning and design support the safe use of the road for cyclists, pedestrians, and vehicle users. There was a lot around the importance of proper use of safety equipment and the ongoing need for road safety education for children and young people. And that sort of revolved around, I guess, this kind of awareness that we got from the data that lots of vehicle collisions involving children as pedestrians seem to happen in the age group where they were sort of starting to become a bit more independent, walking to school, and ensuring that, and therefore our recommendation was to ensure that primary school children particularly receive road safety education, all primary school children, to ensure that they're aware of how to use roads safely, given that the sort of older years of primary school into secondary school is sort of that group that we were seeing being hit as pedestrians in vehicle collisions. We also had this recommendation about implementation of a card or resource which is given to bystanders who witness traumatic events. So there's a brilliant piece of work done by the Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service, who produced this card that they can give out to bystanders who witnessed or reported traumatic events, which signposted them to support. So we were recommending that that's taken on nationally. Deaths then due to violence or maltreatment. So we had 160 deaths in the 3-year period in our cohort. 6 of those children who died because of an underlying health condition that was caused by a violent episode that had occurred some years before their death, and they then died as a consequence of that injury that they'd sustained years previously. The age profile for the deaths you can see there on the screen. So the most common in terms of number was the 15 to 17 year age group. So there were 70. But the children under 1 actually had the highest risk of death. So there were 3 times as many boys as girls, and the risk of death varied by ethnicity. So the lowest risk was in Asian or Asian British children, and the highest risk was in Black or Black British children. Again, we saw an increase in terms of deprivation quintile. So children living in the most deprived areas was greater. The risk was greater for them than in the least deprived neighbourhood. And then we did a bit of work looking at the sort of details of the perpetrators, I guess, in relation to these deaths. So for children under 10 years of age, the perpetrator was either a biological parent or the partner of a biological parent in every single death. And in 43% of those deaths of children under 10, there was more than one perpetrator that was involved in that violent act against that child. Then in 40% of reviews where the perpetrator was a family member, there was evidence of neglect or physical abuse that predated the fatal incident. We then looked a little bit more closely at stabbings, particularly, and firearms-related deaths, which thankfully are relatively uncommon in England. So we had 78 deaths that were due to stabbing or firearms, and most of them, as you can see there, were in the 10 to 17-year-old age group, and the vast majority of deaths in that group were related to stabbings. So that included bladed weapons and then also improvised weapons such as bottles and screwdrivers, and those kind of things. And importantly, there was some evidence then that we saw an increase in stabbings over the 3-year period, and you can see the figures there at the bottom. So the background features then in these deaths of violence and maltreatment, 76% of the 10 to 17-year-old age group had been known to social care at any time in their life, and 41% were known at the time that they died. And then for the under 10 years age group, again, there's a sort of significant number, almost half, which were known at some point during their life, with 13% known still to social care at the time of death. And the contributory factors that they identified in relation to these deaths were challenges with access to services. So that was often things like children being hidden from services, so families not taking them to appointments, or not being able to access services that were present in their area. The complex home circumstances, domestic abuse, neglect is there again in this group. Home safety and living conditions, that came through quite strongly. So poor living conditions, damp, mold, those kind of things, overcrowding in some cases, was also prevalent in this group, as well as developmental conditions and disabilities in the children. So that includes the sort of things I was just talking about in terms of learning disability and neurodiversity. And then school or peer group factors. So that includes sort of, peer pressure, getting excluded from school, and the risks associated with that, again, in terms of visibility to services. So what was the learning? So we had a little bit that was around major trauma pathways in children presenting with penetrating cardiothoracic injuries. So there was learning here about the need to deliver to all clinical teams who might be faced with an emergency of that kind, ongoing education and training on pathways and management decisions. There was importance of engagement around preventative knife crime reduction campaigns, and we have in the report some pretty good examples of successful campaigns in Liverpool, particularly, that have helped to reduce knife crime. And that also includes life-saving skills training for children and young people, so bleed control kits and those kind of things that actually, if young people who are the friends of the victim are trained in that, they can deliver life-saving treatment on scene before help arrives. There was a lot of examples of poor communication and information sharing, and that was particularly when children and young people had moved from one area to another. And then for the under ones age group, we recognised the importance of continued support and implementation of the ICON programme. So this is a programme in England to reduce infant abusive head trauma across the country, and the rollout of that programme is ongoing. We had a couple of recommendations in this group, which was to review the effectiveness of those current programmes for averting deaths from serious violence, especially involving knives and firearms. We asked them to consider the findings in this report in terms of identifying vulnerable groups of children and focusing the help and support accordingly. There was also something about developing and delivering education and training events for clinicians. So that includes simulation-based training on those penetrating injuries and cardiothoracic emergencies, and damage control surgical training for on-call surgical consultants. So that was another recommendation that came through. And you can see there the support of development of standardized bleed control and resuscitation training that I was just talking about. And then this was the myth of invisible men was a government report that was published a little while ago by the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel. So we were just asking that prioritise measures to safeguard and protect children under one in line with the recommendations of this report. I'm going to talk now then about drowning deaths. So again, not a particularly common group overall in terms of numbers, but eminently preventable in terms of the deaths that occur. So we had 84 child deaths due to drowning in the period, and that did increase over the 3-year period. We did see that was statistically significant, and that was in 2 areas. So there were drownings in the bath and inland water drownings, so rivers, lakes, canals, those kind of places. In contrast, we saw a reduction in the number of deaths in swimming pools over the period. We did see that the deaths by drowning are starting to occur earlier in the year. So we're seeing them now March, April and May, that kind of time of year. And there's some suggestion that that's likely to be due to warming climate and the fact that people are in the water when we get those very hot spells of weather. So about half of the drowning deaths occurred in children under 5. Pretty much all of those, I think, were in drownings in the bath. Then there was lower numbers in the 5 to 14-year age group, and then a little bit of a increase again in the 15 to 17-year age group. Again, we see 3 times as many boys as girls in the drowning data. And then the risk of drowning was nearly 3.5 times higher for children of Black ethnicity than their white counterparts. And we don't have any idea why that is. So certainly further work is needed to understand why that disparity exists. And we're in conversations with colleagues in the Royal Life Saving Society about doing an additional piece of work to understand that. And again, the risk of drowning was twice as high for children in the most deprived areas compared with the least deprived. Interestingly, so of the deaths that then CDOPs had reviewed, over half of 8 to 17-year-olds were thought to be able to swim. So that's interesting, because quite often what people will say to us, or what people will focus on when a child is drowned, is whether or not they could swim. But half of these children in that age group were thought to be able to swim and still drowned. Drownings occurred while the child was unsupervised across the age spectrum, but obviously the majority of those were under 5 years old. And so these were drownings in the bath. So the most common reasons that people gave for leaving their child unsupervised was taking a phone call, leaving the room to get something, so a towel or something, attending to a sibling or another young child, or just a sort of miscommunication between groups of adults on who was responsible for supervising the child. In the 10 to 17-year-old age group, 83% were unsupervised by an adult, and that included 13 who were accompanied by another young person at the time of their death. So that did raise some concerns about the possible effect of peer pressure, worry about social exclusion, and what impact that might have on risk-taking behaviour when children and young people are around the water. So the learning then from CDOP reviews highlighted the importance of supervision of children and young people, the need to ensure appropriate warning signs and life-saving equipment is present at locations that are known to be sort of hotspots for swimming, the importance of water safety both in the home and in public places. I'll just say, before I come on to the recommendations, a quick note about baby bath seats, because it's something that we get asked about a lot. So we had in that cohort 7 infants, so 1 year old or younger, who drowned in the bath. And of those 7 infants that drowned in the bath, 5 were using bath seats. I know I think it's in Canada, they've actually banned baby bath seats. And we haven't taken that step here in England as yet. But I know there are national conversations sort of looking at the safety of those devices and how they're marketed, and what decisions might need to be made about that. So our recommendations then were for the younger age group, largely about safe bathing techniques, staying within arm's reach of young children at bath time, and making that a public health focus. So we also suggested, though, that might include updating training packages for professionals, midwives and health visitors, etc., so they're aware of safe bathing techniques. And actually, there's been some action taken on that. There's been updated information put on the NHS England website, and I know that's been disseminated through all of their channels, which really strongly, now in big words at the top of the screen, tells you to stay within arm's reach of young children when they're in the bath. We also asked the government to consider an urgent focused agenda to address the inequalities and provide children unable to access swimming and water safety tuition with access to class-based water safety education. And in fact, to have a cross-departmental roundtable meeting to discuss the risk of drowning, engage with the National Water Safety Forum on that to understand what the opportunities are for prevention measures. And then again, we looked at starting dissemination of water safety advice earlier in the year to ensure that those accessing water in the spring are also aware of safety messages. I'm going to talk now briefly. So those were our 3 main groups: the vehicle collisions, violence and drowning. And then I've got just a few more slides. So deaths due to drug and alcohol poisoning. We had 47 in the period where that was thought to be, a death was thought to be as a result of drug or alcohol poisoning. So that excludes deaths that were thought to be a deliberate overdose. So this is what you might term recreational drugs or illicit drugs that were taken. There were 47 deaths. All of those were over the age of 10 years. And they had used illicit drugs, prescription drugs, antihistamines, and inhaled gases in that group. So 24% of those children who died, there was more than one drug recorded in their system at the time of their death, so nearly a quarter. And so the most common type of drug taken by children and young people was stimulants. So mostly that was MDMA, also known as ecstasy, and cocaine. The next most common group was depressants. So that includes inhaled gases and aerosol inhalation. But you can see that the numbers are much lower than the number who were taking MDMA. Again, where we had the data, 50% of children and young people who died as a result of drug poisoning were known to mental health services at the time of their death. And the learning that was identified here, in short, was about ensuring peer awareness of warning flags. So we saw quite strongly in the data for these children that their friends sometimes didn't call for help, didn't call for emergency services because they worried that they were going to get into trouble, or they worried that, they didn't think it was particularly, a bad reaction or anything like that. So it was about helping those young people to understand how to recognize an adverse reaction and when to call for help from the emergency services. Then deaths due to other unintentional injuries. So the numbers of these are much smaller, so there's not as much to say as we could say about the other groups. But accidental strangulation or suffocation, we had 42 deaths. 9 of those were deaths due to strangulation by blind or curtain cords or cables. We've done quite a big bit of work in terms of raising awareness for how people can make blind cords safe in their homes. The other deaths in that group cover things like entrapment. So we've seen cases where babies have been asleep on the bed and they've sort of got wedged between the bed and the wall of the mattress and the frame of the bed. So again, those kind of things would fall into this group. We looked at deaths due to falls. So there were 31 children that died as the result of a fall. The most common place that the child fell from was an open window. And 65% of those children who fell, it was either in their own home or in the home of a friend or family member that the fall occurred. We looked at choking and foreign object consumption. There were 21 deaths as a result of choking or foreign object consumption. Most of those were choking or food inhalation. The most common items of food being grapes and sausage. There were a few other things in there. In 8 of those cases, it was a non-food item that they'd choked on. So little bits from toys, other small plastic or metal objects. We looked at children who died as a result of an object falling on them. There were 10 of those. And in 8 of those instances, the incident occurred outside of the home. So they were either at school, at a shop, in another public place. And the kind of things that fell on them were sort of trees or branches, mirrors, lockers, walls, and very sadly, fireplace surrounds. Were the things that had fallen. And so the learning here was mainly about ensuring that items in the home or in any environment really were fully and properly secured to the walls. I remember a little while back when the World Cup was on and a lot of people went out and bought flat screen TVs. There was a little sort of glut of them where people hadn't attached the television safely to the wall, or it had sort of toppled over, and we saw a few injuries as a result of that. The last group that we looked at were animal attacks. So there were 6 deaths as a result of injuries sustained in an animal attack. In all cases, the animal involved was a dog. And so I suppose fairly obviously the learning there was about close supervision when children are with dogs so they can live safely together. So we had a few recommendations for the other unintentional injuries. Mainly that was around including window restrictors and blind cord cleats in the Decent Home Standards Review. So that's something that's being looked at by the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities at the moment. And then importantly, to ensure that all children and young people between 10 and 18 years are provided with evidence-based, age-appropriate drug and alcohol education with health and wellbeing education throughout primary school. And that was a recommendation made to the Department for Education. And we had then some sort of general recommendations which cut across all of these deaths. So to revise and update the sudden unexpected death in infancy multi-agency guidelines for care and investigation. So those are the guidelines that cover what we call our joint agency response protocol, which is a protocol that kicks in when a child dies suddenly and unexpectedly in England. We also wanted to raise awareness among healthcare professionals of post-traumatic stress disorder and complex grief, and how this might affect family whose children have died in these kinds of incidents. So better signposting to specialist help for those families where it's needed. I won't go through these recommendations in a lot of detail. They're there in the report if people are interested in seeing them. But these were mainly about improving sharing of information and learning between systems. So there was lots of examples of where information could have been known by lots of people, and that might have helped to support particular families or children, and that wasn't done effectively. So there were a few recommendations made in relation to that. This slide just gives you our contact information. If you're interested to follow us on Twitter, you can see us there at @NCMD_England. You can look at our website or sign up to our mailing list and find our guidance for professionals there at that link. I also just wanted to say that I'm speaking at the Trauma Care Conference in Yarnfield that Anna mentioned in March. So I look forward to seeing anyone there who is joining us. And I think that's the end of my slides, Anna, so we can go to the Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for such a thorough talk. Just going to wonderful. So hopefully this works this time round and we all see the correct screen, but if not, I'm sure people will let me know. Are we seeing the correct screen? Are we seeing the wrong screen?
I think it looks like the right screen to me, Anna.
Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. So before we move on to the questions, and we have had a few come in the chat, I have popped a link to the, I've not got my glasses on, so I can't really read without those. So I have popped a link to the report that we were talking about tonight, so everyone can use it. And someone asked as well in the question to refer to it in their, I think it was the student report. So that is available in the chat for you guys to check out. Before we move on to the questions, though, I do just want to draw attention to the next webinar that we have coming up. It is on Thursday again, February the 1st at 8 o'clock. If you scan the QR code that's on your screen now, hopefully, because I forgot to test this particular QR code, it will take you straight through to the sign-up page. And we have got Duncan McGarry, MBE, with us to talk about family assistance centres after a disaster. Duncan has worked thoroughly and had a very long, successful career as a family liaison officer. He's gone all around the world to do this, so it's going to be an incredible talk from someone who has lived through it all, everything from the Hillsborough disaster to mass incidents. So they've really been around the block on those. So it's going to be a very interesting talk. And the Q&A section. So the QR code that is on your screen now, I've tried to make it bigger this year because I think last year the QR code was about the size of my thumb and people couldn't scan it. So if you want to get your CPD certificate tonight, if you are not a member of Trauma Care, I repeat, not a member of Trauma Care, please do scan the QR code that's on your screen now. It will take you through to the type form, which is your feedback form. You can fill this out and for £1.99 you can purchase your certificate. Or as I mentioned, you can also become a member of Trauma Care and receive your CPD certificate for tonight's webinar for free. If you sign up now, it will still count towards a free certificate. Don't worry, we're going to keep going until about Monday, and anyone who sort of joins after that will have to wait for the next one. But yes, do scan the QR code that's on your screen now to purchase your certificate for just £1.99, with all proceeds going back to Trauma Care so we can do things like this. Now, as I said, please do not post any questions in the chat because I haven't got it open, nor can I see it, so they will get missed. However, the first question that was asked was during the drowning section that you were talking about. And Marcus, I'm sorry if you didn't want to be known there, Marcus, but Marcus Gates asked, interesting comments on entering water earlier in the year, water at its coldest. Being able to swim leads them into the water, but cold water shock may be the reason for drowning.
Yep. 100% I agree, Marcus. So like one of the things that we reflected on when we were looking at the data was that obviously in England, children are taught to swim in heated pools indoors, and then when they go out into the world and they're swimming in a lake or a river or something like that, they have to contend with very cold water, with tides and currents, etc. If they're in the sea as well, and that makes it a very different prospect than what they're used to, having learnt to swim in the swimming pools. So that was one of the things that we highlighted. So we did a presentation on this at the all-party parliamentary group on water safety for government, and that was one of the things that we highlighted there. When the information comes into us, usually the cause of death is recorded as drowning, so it wouldn't specifically say whether cold water shock was a feature, but I've no doubt that it would be in many of those cases. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think it, even cold water shock, I don't think it differentiates between pediatric or adult really either. It's definitely something that happens across the board.
Yeah.
I have managed to get the chat up. So Ian, who asked a question in the chat, I have found it, don't worry. So Vicky, you mentioned entrapment as a cause of suffocation, where parents cannot be dissuaded from allowing co-sleeping. Do you think that bed guards are good because they prevent a fall, or bad because of the risk of suffocation? So bed guards, yes or no?
It sort of depends on the age of the baby, I think, so, or the age of the child. So definitely it's not something we would look to be recommending for very young children or babies. We've seen some, so we've written a separate report on sudden infant deaths, or cot deaths, as some people know them. And we've definitely seen some deaths that occur in those sort of three-sided cots that you attach to the side of the bed. I think for older children, it's less of an issue. So the group that we saw that were most at risk for entrapment were babies. So these are babies that have been put down to sleep on an adult double bed with no guards, no nothing. And they've sort of rolled over and got themselves wedged between the wall, or between the mattress and the headboard, or wherever they've happened to be. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I think for very young children, it's probably not a good idea. They should be, in any event, in a cot with no clutter and no objects and everything else. And the safe sleeping advice that we've got in England through Lullaby Trust and others does reflect that. But I think as they get a little bit older and they're moving around more, this is when that becomes more of a risk. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. So Karen Porter, so Karen, thank you for joining us. We have noticed in our major trauma network a hotspot for river drownings. What do you suggest we work with? No, sorry, what? Who do you suggest we work with to target for education and awareness? Do you have any recommendation of companies, charities that can raise awareness?
Immediately that comes to mind is, so Royal Life Saving Society would be one, and I'm very happy to put you in touch with Karen with our contacts there if that's helpful. But the other thing that comes to mind is RNLI. So at the moment, people probably know RNLI are mainly, their lifeboats obviously are mainly there to deal with coastal drownings. But I think that it would be interesting to think about whether they could consider, now that we know for children that most of them don't drown on the coast, whether they, I don't know, and I don't know if they have resource for this, but whether they could consider deploying resources at hotspots in relation to rivers and places that are inland. Other than that, I think the advice would be to look at working with your local public health teams in your ICBs to see what they can do to help. Yeah.
Yeah, and Pippa's commented on this question as well, sort of saying Swim England need to be involved in preventing drowning, which I completely agree with as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Karen, if you'd like to send an email to admin@traumacare.org.uk, and I'll put you in touch with Vicky to get those links, those charity links, and people to refer to. So Mark Woodall has asked, what is the NCMD equivalent in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland?
That's an excellent question. Sadly, there isn't an equivalent at the moment. So when NCMD was commissioned, there was initially discussions about it being a four nations resource. And for one reason or another, that ended up not happening. There are child death review processes in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They work a bit differently to the process to how the process works in England. They've also, thankfully, got far fewer deaths than we see in England. So there is some sort of centralisation of the process, a sort of local level that didn't exist before NCMD was a thing in England. So I think if you're interested, I can certainly put you in contact with the people in those organizations in the devolved nations, and they would be probably your best bet if you're interested in getting equivalent data. Yeah.
Again, email the office, and so if anyone, if Carrie, I'll say this as a general rule. If Vicky just say, please get in contact, and if you email the office, we'll forward it on to Vicky as well, just for GDPR and whatnot. So please do email admin@traumacare.org.uk. We'll forward them all on to Vicky, who will be able to provide all the resources that you guys are asking for. And Rachel, really good to see you. Well, see your name at least. Has just popped a lovely link into the chat as well about the UK drowning prevention strategy that is available as well. So do check that resource out. And Canals and River Trust cover water safety regionally. There's loads of suggestions coming into the TAC about who to
yeah, that's brilliant. All brilliant suggestions.
Yeah. So just a very simple question from an anonymous attendee. So Anonymous has asked, how did the children in bath seats die? Did the seat come loose, fall over in the water, or was there another mechanism that caused the drowning?
So it was sort of slightly different in each case, depending on the sort of specific type of bath seat that there was. But what we generally saw was that it was the type where there were sort of suction cups on the bottom of the thing. The suction cups failed, and the bath seat sort of tipped over and tipped the baby into the water. And so that led us into a conversation about, is this a product design issue? And interestingly, so we're having some conversations with the Office for Product Safety and Standards so that's the government department responsible for product safety, about bath seats. In fact, I think I've got a meeting on Monday about it. But they would look to try and see whether it's a design issue that needs to be resolved or whether it's a sort of awareness raising issue. I think for us, one of the key problems was that people think of bath seats as a safety device, but in fact, they're not really a safety device. So when you speak to parents, they'll tell you, if I hadn't had the bath seat, I wouldn't have left the baby alone. So it's giving them that sort of false sense of reassurance that everything's safe. So it's okay to go out of the room and get a towel when actually they're not really designed or tested as safety devices. And I think that's probably the key issue. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose the recommendation is just get in the bath with the child and keep them upright, hold them. Yeah. Which I am absolutely going to pass on to my best friend who's just had a baby and just bought a bath seat. So that's going straight to her. And going back onto the drowning section, Gavin as well has just pointed out another resource for the water sections of Lowland Search and Rescue, which I think is a very interesting and relevant one. And I think this might be the final question, which is lovely, from Marcus. What do you see changing following the tragic death of Branson Battersby?
Oh gosh. Firstly, that was horrendous.
Yes.
So I heard about it in the news yesterday, probably as lots of other people did. It's a tricky one, that. I mean, I know the family were known to sort of social care. I know that the sort of thought is that poor little Branson died of starvation after his dad had a heart attack. It's really so apart from the fact that it's very sad that there has been some obvious sort of breakdowns in communication in terms of the sort of service provision elements of it. It's really sad that, in that period from, I think it was the 27th of December to the 9th of January, nobody in his family even tried to find or noticed that they weren't in contact or tried to find what was happening. So it's a really sad thing across the board. I'm not sure what will change as a result of it. I guess we'll wait and see what the investigation show and the inquest shows. I know I saw that I think the mum was speaking on the news recently, and she's obviously very angry and upset and has some thoughts about where she thinks the responsibility for this lies. I'm not sure whether anything that we could do in terms of national learning might make a difference in this case. Yeah, I mean, that's not a great answer, Anna, I'm aware, but it's just a very kind of difficult set of circumstances, isn't it? And tragic set of circumstances. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose with this absolutely awful case that's come out, and until there's been a more thorough investigation, more research done into it, and more more questions and answers have been raised, you can't really predict what
Yeah.
kind of changes or legislation might come into play. I mean, the circumstances that the poor boy did unfortunately, pass away is so tragic. It's hard to
Yeah.
sort of predict what could potentially change, I guess.
And I suppose we definitely, it's worth saying, haven't seen any other deaths like that have occurred in our data set. We started collecting data in April 2019 when we were first commissioned. We've not seen anything else like this. So it's possible that it's one of those sort of black swan events where it's just a tragic kind of thing where all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up, or whatever the
Yeah,
metaphor is. But yeah, I suppose what I can say is to reassure people that Branson will have a child death review the same as any other child in England. So if there is something to be learned from it, we will pull that out and make sure that that's taken forward for national learning. Yeah.
of course. And I think everyone is. I think it's quite. I don't really know how to phrase this, but I suppose if our thoughts are definitely with anyone that's affected by it, and it is such an awful thing that's happened recently.
Yeah.
And I suppose when you're doing a session like this, you're not really going to get the most pleasant Q&As coming in, but they are important questions that need to
They
be
are.
asked, really, and
Yeah.
that's what we're here for. That's what we're here to do.
Yeah.
Um, Now, this is the final question of the night, but it's come in just at the last minute, so I thought we'd best ask it. Wendy Vasallo has asked, apologies if I pronounced your last name wrong there, Wendy, but has asked, choking on grapes, chicken nuggets and sweets, etc. are all cases I came across as a nurse, unfortunately. Is there a safety campaign on this? So choking on smaller items, I suppose.
Yeah, there absolutely is. Anna, I'll send you over the link so people can have a look at it. Broadly speaking, the advice is cut things lengthwise, not acrosswise. So if instead of cutting the grape across the middle, so the circumference of a grape happens to be exactly the same circumference as the food pipe or the esophagus in a small child. So if you cut it lengthwise, same with sort of hot dogs and sausages and those things, it obviously prevents that from happening, because if they do just swallow it quickly, it can pass straight down without blocking the airway. So I'll send you over the link that you can circulate to everyone, because there are some campaigns and information for families and things about that which we want to get out as widely as possible. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And as I said, I always send a follow-up email to everyone anyway. So any relevant links or things that are sent across or known, I will make sure that is put in the email. And rather than sending it to just the non-members, so they get the link to the CPD certificate, I'll send it around to everyone who has joined in tonight, so you can all get the relevant links and guidelines.
Fantastic.
So that is everything from myself tonight. The last thing that I have to do, which I love to do because I love to give these guys a shout out, is just say thank you to Trauma Care's wonderful sponsors. Without these guys, we wouldn't be able to do what we do, which is bring wonderful, relevant and needed topics to the forefront and talk about them. So first up, I just want to say thank you to QualSafe, who are our first aid sponsors. So again, a really relevant sponsor for tonight. If you check out their website, you can find out more about them. Galen, who I'm sure you've all heard of, who are the proud manufacturers of Penthrox. Do check out all their products that are available at galenpharma.com. And finally, Icarus, the power of health, who create lots of simulated, cool, wonderful, extreme medicine courses for you to attend. I'm sure they've got plenty coming up this year for you to check out. So that is everything from myself tonight. I just want to say thank you, Vicky, very, very much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us as well. Thank you for the support to Trauma Care and for helping us in everything that we do. Vicky, it's probably what a way to start the 2024 webinar series. Absolutely fantastic, wonderful, brilliant session. Now, I will say now, when I click end session tonight, it's going to end it for everyone. So Vicky, from myself and on behalf of Trauma Care, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for bringing a brilliant topic. Everyone said it in the comments as well. So wherever you are in the world, as we've seen Philippines, USA, New Zealand, Australia, all sorts of people joining us tonight from snowy, I think someone said it was snowing where they are, so enjoy building that snowman. Wherever you are in the world, take care of yourself, your loved ones, check in on them. Be kind to yourself and to everyone around you, and enjoy the rest of your week, even though there's only a day left in it. But good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
Anna. Bye-bye.
Enjoy. Thank you. Bye-bye.